Hello lovers. Eleanor here. Tonight, we will embark on a journey that begins not in the pages of a dusty history book, but right here, in the dim light of my little kitchen. The clock ticks with a kind of stubborn regularity, as if it's keeping time for someone else's life, not mine. The radiator hums softly. My only companion, apart from the glass of wine at my elbow. Its deep red catches the lamplight, and for a moment, I imagine it's the same shade as the burgundy served in the officers' mess halls decades ago. Funny, isn't it? How a scent or a taste can pull you somewhere entirely different. If you enjoy these journeys through time, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. Sometimes, the quiet hits hardest not at night, but at dinner. One plate, one fork. The faint clink of cutlery against china that echoes louder than it has any right to. I've lived with solitude long enough to know it doesn't always roar. It seeps. It comes in as a whisper, curling at the edges of the day. And tonight, it curls around me. I let it. Because I've learned, some silences deserve to be listened to. It was over another lonely dinner, years ago, that I first heard the story I'm about to tell you. A man, thin, pale, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco, sat across from me at a charity function. He spoke little, until the conversation drifted to the war. Then his eyes shifted, as if looking inward, and he murmured about a city on the brink, a city that would have fallen, had it not been for a woman whose name no one seemed to remember. A nurse. He didn't tell me her name that night. He didn't know it himself. All he had was the memory of her figure, moving quickly through a hospital ward as shells fell somewhere in the distance. That image stayed with me, as stubborn as the tick of that kitchen clock. The city he spoke of was a place I'd visited once, in my younger years. Back then, it had the careless charm of a European postcard. Cobblestones that sang under your shoes. Shutters thrown open to let the smell of bread drift into the street. But during the war, it was different. Cut off. Crumbling. Its people trapped between the hunger of an advancing army and the invisible hand of disease. I like to think the nurse, whoever she truly was, understood both dangers equally. History loves to write about generals and treaties, but it is far more reluctant to honor the hands that hold the dying, the eyes that never close while the world burns outside. Now, settle in comfortably. Close your eyes. And let's travel back in time with Eleanor. The city lay under a sky heavy with the scent of winter snow. Frost gripped the roofs, turning them into jagged silver crowns. Smoke rose from chimneys, thin and trembling, as if afraid to draw attention. And in the heart of that city was a hospital. Old even then, its walls the color of unpolished bone. Inside, the air was warm, but thick with the sickly sweet tang of infection. Beds lined the corridors. Not because the rooms were full. Those had been taken long ago. But because so many lay ill that even the halls became wards. The nurse appeared not with fanfare, but as though she had always been there. Tall, with hair bound neatly under her cap. Eyes sharp in a way that told you she saw more than she let on. In the weeks that followed, she became a quiet center of chaos. No matter how loud the coughing, how near the thud of shell fire, her voice remained steady. I imagine her walking those corridors at dusk, the dim light pooling in her wake, her shadow stretching long over the cold stone floor. Perhaps she was thinking not of glory, but of the next vial of medicine, the next ration of bread she could smuggle past the checkpoints. The man at that dinner told me one more thing before we parted. he said. Without her, Eleanor, that city wouldn't just have lost lives. It would have lost its soul. He said it with such certainty that I've carried those words for decades. And tonight, I will carry you with me. Back to that city. To the days when she became its unspoken savior. Snow began to fall the next morning. Thick and deliberate. As though the sky itself meant to seal the city off from the rest of the world. The streets muffled under its weight. But the sounds of war. The distant rumble of artillery. The occasional crack of rifle fire. Slipped through the whiteness like cold fingers under a door. I picture her. Our nameless nurse. Pulling her coat tighter as she stepped out into that snow. Boots crunching with every determined stride toward the hospital gates. It wasn't just the sick who waited for her. The city had begun to see her as something else entirely. A messenger. A provider. A flicker of certainty in days when certainty had all but vanished. Children whispered about her. Calling her the lady with the basket, because she never arrived empty-handed. Sometimes it was medicine. Sometimes bread. Once, it was simply a bundle of dry socks for a soldier whose feet were bleeding from the cold. There's something deeply human in that. Don't you think? How the smallest tacks. A pair of socks. A slice of bread. Become lifelines when the world has turned to chaos. As a history teacher, I've always told my students that wars are won on maps. But survived in kitchens. Hospitals. And alleyways. That's where the real victories live. The hospital itself was no fortress. Its windows rattled with each nearby explosion. In some wards, blankets had been nailed over the panes to keep the drafts out, casting the rooms into perpetual twilight. The nurse moved through them like a ghost of light. Always with purpose. Never with wasted motion. When medicine ran low, she made rounds with water and scraps of fabric to cool fevers. When food dwindled, she divided her own rations into pieces so small they barely covered a palm. But survival wasn't her only battle. Disease had crept in alongside the war. Typhus. Influenza. Infections born from untreated wounds. The city's dwindling supplies made treatment a gamble. Every injection. Every poultice. Every glass of boiled water was a calculated decision. Who might live if given this? Who might die if not? I can only imagine the weight of those choices. One story, told to me years later by a doctor who had been a young intern then, still lingers with me. There was a boy, perhaps 12, brought in from the streets. He had been found shivering in a stairwell, his legs too weak to stand. The prognosis was grim. Even the doctor thought he wouldn't last the night. But the nurse sat with him for hours, speaking softly, stroking his hair, coaxing him to sip warm broth spoon by spoon. Against every expectation, the boy lived. Why did she do it? The doctor had asked her at dawn. And she had answered. Because sometimes, winning means keeping just one more candle lit. I think about that a lot. Candles. How they flicker in the dark. Stubborn against the wind. I've had my own nights when the dark felt too close. Too heavy. And yet, a small light. Be it a kind word. A shared memory. Or simply the knowledge that someone cares. Has kept me here. Perhaps you've had nights like that. Too. That winter was long. And the siege unrelenting. The nurse grew thinner. Her eyes, once merely sharp, began to carry the weight of exhaustion. But there was no falter in her step. No hesitation in her hands. She became, in her quiet way, as vital to the city's defense as any soldier on the wall. And then came the day that would etch her forever into its history. Though even now, her name is a mystery. It began with a warning. Enemy troops were advancing faster than expected, and the hospital might soon be in a direct line of fire. Most would have evacuated. But she stayed. Because sometimes, you don't leave the candles. You stand beside them until the very end. The day the front line reached the hospital was one the city would never forget. I imagine the scene with an ache in my chest. The air so cold it burned the lungs. The snow now muddied with ash. And the low roar of artillery shaking the ground as if the earth itself were tired of holding the weight of war. She, our nurse, stood in the main corridor with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands still damp from scrubbing down the last usable instruments. Outside, soldiers were shouting, their boots pounding the frozen street. Inside, the air smelled of disinfectant and fear. A messenger burst through the door. Barely more than a boy. His cheeks raw from the wind. "They're coming," he gasped. "You have to leave." But she didn't. She looked around the ward. At the rows of faces turned toward her. Some pale with fever. Others waxy with pain. And I suspect she understood that her leaving would mean more than the loss of a nurse. It would mean the loss of hope. And hope was in shorter supply than penicillin. There's an image I can't shake. Her stepping to the window. Peering through the cracked glass to see the enemy troops pushing through the snow. Their dark shapes moving like a tide against the white. Somewhere deep inside, she must have felt the instinct to run. To save herself. But she stayed rooted. And in that stillness, she made her choice. She began moving from bed to bed. Speaking quietly. Her voice steady even as the sound of gunfire drew closer. One man tried to rise. An injured soldier with bandaged ribs. But she pressed him gently back and whispered something that made him close his eyes and nod. Another patient, a young woman cradling a newborn, was handed a bundle of blankets. The nurse wrapped them tighter around the child. Her fingers quick and sure. And then the first shell hit. The floor trembled. Plaster fell from the ceiling like snow. I imagine her flinching. Anyone would. But she didn't pause. She signaled to two orderlies to help move the most fragile patients to the cellar. Here's the part that feels almost like legend. When the second blast came, shattering the front windows, she shielded a patient with her own body, taking a spray of glass along her arm. She bound it herself, quickly, with a strip of gauze, and kept going. I've told my students before that bravery is rarely loud. It's not the speeches, the grand gestures. It's the quiet refusal to step back when the world tells you to. She embodied that. By nightfall, the firing slowed. The enemy had passed through, leaving the hospital battered but standing. In the cellar, by candlelight, she walked among the huddled patients, checking pulses, adjusting bandages, offering sips of water. One of the soldiers later said, "It was like she carried a piece of the city's heart with her." I know what he meant. I've seen people like that. People who, without ever raising their voice, seem to hold the very center of a room, a street, even a city, in their hands. And yet, when the danger had passed for the night, she didn't sit down. She went upstairs, swept the broken glass from the floor, and righted the fallen chairs. I imagine her pausing then, leaning against the wall for just a moment, eyes closed, letting herself feel the fatigue. Because even the bravest have to lean sometimes. The weeks that followed were a blur of cold mornings, dwindling supplies, and the constant, knowing uncertainty of whether the next day would bring peace or destruction. The city was under siege in every sense. Not just by soldiers, but by hunger, sickness, and the slow erosion of faith. I picture her, each dawn, stepping into that long, narrow ward with a lantern in hand, its light casting deep shadows along the cracked plaster walls. The beds were closer now. The influx of wounded had forced them to push the cots together, so close that one man's cough became another's nightmare. The nurse moved through it like a quiet current, weaving between the beds, the smell of antiseptic and unwashed bodies clinging to her. She rationed everything: cotton, alcohol, even kindness. Not because she wanted to, but because she had to. She learned to cut bandages into halves, to stretch a bottle of morphine far beyond what the manual said was possible. When she found an old jar of honey in the kitchen stores, she didn't eat it. She used it for burn dressings, knowing its healing properties, even as her own stomach cramped from hunger. The enemy came and went like a tide. Sometimes, the streets outside were filled with foreign soldiers, their boots loud and alien on cobblestones that once rang with the laughter of schoolchildren. Other times, the city fell into a strange, tense quiet, as though the air itself was holding its breath. During those quiet hours, she would step outside to sweep the hospital steps. Not because it mattered to the enemy, but because it mattered to the people inside. I've always believed that small acts, in the right hands, become fortresses. She was building one, invisible but strong, in the minds of her patients. There was one night, late January, I think, when a rumor swept through the hospital that the water supply had been poisoned. Panic rippled down the hallways. Soldiers argued with doctors, some insisting on boiling every drop, others saying there was no time. The nurse didn't join the shouting. She quietly gathered a few buckets, walked through the snow to a nearby well, and returned with fresh water herself. Her hands were red with cold, her breath coming in sharp clouds, but she smiled when she set the buckets down. "No poison here," she said. And people believed her. It's strange, isn't it? How certain voices can still the noise of a crowd. By February, food was nearly gone. Bread was rationed to scraps, and meat was only a memory. The nurse began to lose weight. Her uniform hung loosely on her frame. But she didn't let the patients see her weakness. She always kept her posture straight, her step brisk, her tone gentle but firm. One of the doctors told her she should rest, that working this way day after day would kill her. She only laughed. A dry, almost soundless laugh. And replied, "Then I'll die doing something worth the trouble." I've turned that phrase over in my mind many times. It makes me wonder about the choices we all face. Do we preserve ourselves at all costs? Or do we spend our strength for the sake of others, knowing it may never be repaid? The spring thaw came late that year. And when it did, the city smelled of damp stone and smoke. It was then that she heard the first whispers of liberation. Not certainty. Just the possibility that the siege might end. But possibility is a dangerous thing. It can lift the spirit too high, only to let it fall harder. She kept her focus on the present. The fever in bed 12. The broken leg in bed 4. The soldier with a letter from home he couldn't bear to open. She was, in every way, the city's heartbeat. And yet, no one knew her name beyond the hospital walls. That, perhaps, is the tragedy of it. The day liberation came was not the triumphant swell of music and flags that one might imagine. It was hesitant at first, like a whisper in the wind that carried down the empty boulevards. The nurse was on the second floor, tending to a boy who had been brought in with shrapnel wounds to his arm, when she noticed a change in the air. It wasn't the smell of smoke, nor the low rumble of artillery. It was the absence of it. The silence felt alive. She stepped to the window, her breath catching as she saw figures moving in the distance. Not the gray uniforms they had grown used to, but the familiar colors of their own soldiers. People began to gather in the street below, cautious at first, then spilling out from doorways and alleys, their voices rising in disbelief and joy. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes. The weight in her chest loosened. But only for a moment. There was still work to do. Inside the hospital, chaos replaced despair. Some patients tried to stand when they heard the news, tearing open wounds in their eagerness to see the city freed. Others wept quietly into their pillows, the sound carrying down the corridors like rain on a tin roof. The nurse moved through it all with her steady, unhurried pace, ensuring no one was forgotten in the rush of history. By afternoon, soldiers came. Young, tired men whose boots were caked in mud. They brought bread, tins of meat, and blankets. The nurse watched as one soldier, barely more than a boy, handed his own scarf to an elderly patient. "You'll need it more than me, grandmother," he said, his voice breaking. I think of her in that moment, standing in the middle of the ward, surrounded by both the newly arrived liberators and the survivors she had kept alive. She must have felt a strange kind of pride. Not the loud, flag-waving kind, but the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done her part. But liberation is not an instant cure. The city was scarred. Buildings were shells, streets littered with debris, families torn apart. The nurse stayed in the hospital, not because anyone ordered her to, but because leaving before her patients could walk out with their own strength felt wrong. It was in those first weeks after the siege that her work changed. She became less of a healer of wounds and more of a mender of spirits. She organized small gatherings in the hospital courtyard, where those well enough to sit outside could feel the sun again. She coaxed them into telling stories of their homes, their childhoods, their dreams for the future. It was in those stories that the city began to breathe again. One evening, as she sat with a group of former soldiers, they asked her about her own past. She hesitated, then told them of a little village she'd left behind, of her husband lost to the first days of fighting, of her decision to serve in the city hospital instead of fleeing to safety. There was no bitterness in her voice, only a kind of gentle acceptance. "I stayed," she said simply, "because someone had to." Those words stayed with them. And with me. They have a way of stripping away excuses. When the hospital finally began discharging patients into a city that was learning to stand again, she remained. There were always more to tend to. The malnourished, the orphaned, the ones who had survived the siege only to face a new kind of struggle. But outside those hospital walls, her name faded into anonymity. History recorded the liberation in speeches and photographs, in statues and parades, but not in the memory of the woman who had kept the city's pulse steady through its darkest nights. I sometimes wonder if she would have wanted it any other way. News of her work during the siege began to ripple quietly through the streets, not in headlines or proclamations, but in murmurs exchanged over market stalls and in letters sent to distant relatives. People spoke of the nurse in the same way one speaks of a half-remembered song. Softly, reverently, afraid that saying too much might cause the memory to vanish. By this time, the city had begun its slow transformation. The craters in the streets were patched with uneven cobblestones, and shopkeepers reopened their doors, selling whatever goods they could scrape together. Yet beneath the surface, wounds still festered. Not just in bodies, but in trust, in spirit. It was here that her role became something almost invisible. She started visiting families in their homes, especially those who had lost someone. Often, she brought no medicine, no bandages, only a loaf of bread, or sometimes nothing at all but her presence. She would sit at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of tea, listening to the grief that poured out. She didn't offer platitudes. She simply bore witness. One family in particular stays etched in my mind. A father and daughter, the last of their household. The girl, no more than 12, had stopped speaking since her mother's death during the siege. Doctors had tried. Neighbors had coaxed. But her silence remained. The nurse came every evening for 2 weeks, reading aloud from a battered book of folk tales. On the 15th night, the girl whispered a single word. Again. And just like that, the first thread of life had been rewoven. It wasn't only the people she helped who noticed. One day, a city official appeared at the hospital with a letter sealed in wax. It was an invitation to attend a formal ceremony, honoring those who had rendered extraordinary service to the city. But when the day came, she did not attend. The medal was sent to her by post. It remained in its box, tucked away in the bottom drawer of her desk. I imagine she felt the ceremony was for others. The generals. The politicians. Not for someone whose victories were measured in heartbeats and small acts of dignity. And yet, controversy would soon touch her story. Rumors began to circulate that she had once treated enemy soldiers during the siege. In truth, she had. When a young man in a tattered uniform, clearly on the wrong side of the front, was dragged into the ward, bleeding and terrified, she had not turned him away. A wound doesn't choose a side, she reportedly said. Some saw this as compassion beyond politics. Others whispered the word traitor. It is here that I pause, my tea cooling beside me. Because history is rarely neat. We like our heroes pure, their choices clean and unblemished. But life does not grant us that luxury. Was she wrong? Or did she, in that moment, cling to a deeper truth? That mercy is the only thing that survives the ruin of war? When I think of her walking the hospital corridors, passing beds occupied by friend and foe alike, I picture her as a lighthouse keeper during a storm. The light doesn't choose which ships to guide. It simply shines. Her final years in the hospital were quieter. Fewer emergencies. More long-term care. She was often seen sitting by the windows in the afternoon, mending uniforms for patients or peeling apples with a small paring knife. The bustle of the city continued beyond the walls. But inside, her pace remained steady, unhurried, almost timeless. And still, her name never appeared in the official histories. No portrait in the city hall. No plaque on the hospital wall. Only in the stories passed from mouth to mouth did she endure. Fragile. Perhaps. But enduring nonetheless. I find myself wondering. Is that the truest kind of remembrance? Not the cold permanence of stone, but the living warmth of memory, carried like a secret from one heart to another. The winter after the siege was the coldest anyone could remember. The river froze in jagged layers, and the wind seemed to slice through wool and skin alike. Coal was scarce. So families huddled together in a single room, using every scrap of cloth they could find to block the drafts. Even the hospital, with its thick stone walls, felt like an icebox. She continued her rounds, her boots leaving crisp imprints in the snow as she moved from door to door. Sometimes, she brought soup or a bundle of firewood. Other times, she carried nothing at all. Only her steady presence, which seemed to warm even the iciest rooms. People began to anticipate her knock. Not because she brought miracles, but because she reminded them that they had not been forgotten. I once read in an old account that she had a habit of writing small notes to leave behind. Just a few words on scraps of paper. "You will heal. The spring will come. Your mother would be proud." She left them tucked inside books, pinned to curtains, even slipped into coat pockets. Some were found years later, yellowed and fragile, but still carrying that quiet voice of hope. The city's leaders, meanwhile, were facing a different challenge. Rebuilding not just the physical infrastructure, but the trust of a population weary of authority. Rumors swirled about stolen aid shipments, black market deals, and secret bargains with former enemies. When one scandal broke, proving that food meant for starving families had been sold abroad, the anger was palpable. Riots threatened to erupt. In the midst of this, the nurse became an unlikely voice of calm. She was asked to speak at a small gathering in the town hall, meant to reassure citizens that the hospital remained untouched by political games. She agreed, reluctantly. Her speech lasted less than 3 minutes. She did not praise the government, nor condemn it. Instead, she spoke about the importance of tending to one another's wounds, whether of the body or the heart, and about the danger of letting bitterness take root. "We rebuild not only with bricks," she said, "but with kindness that refuses to die." It is strange how such simple words can carry more weight than hours of rhetoric. People left that hall quieter than they had entered. Not because their anger was gone, but because it had been tempered, like steel cooled in water. Still, there were those who resented her influence. A local newspaper, aligned with a political faction, published an article implying that she was naive, that her soft approach allowed corruption to continue unchecked. She never responded publicly, but I imagine the words stung. For all her stoicism, she was not made of stone. One evening, as the snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, she returned to the hospital after visiting a patient. In the courtyard, she found a young man, barely more than a boy, leaning against the wall, shivering. His coat was threadbare, and his eyes darted like a cornered animal's. When she asked what he needed, he said nothing at first, then finally whispered, "I heard you help people." He was a deserter, hiding from both sides of the fractured political landscape. He had a fever and a wound that had gone untreated for days. She led him inside, gave him soup, and cleaned his injury. She asked no questions about his loyalties. In her mind, I believe, there were no sides when it came to suffering. This choice would come back to haunt her. A week later, the boy was captured and publicly executed. Word spread quickly, and some accused her of aiding a criminal. Others quietly thanked her for showing him humanity in his final days. And so her legacy continued to grow. Not through neat tales of triumph, but through the messy, human truth of compassion in impossible circumstances. I sit here tonight, the lamplight casting a golden circle on my table, and I wonder if she ever felt as lonely as I do now. The kind of loneliness that isn't cured by company, but only by the knowledge that what you've done has mattered. Perhaps she knew that kind of solace, Or perhaps she simply kept walking. Because to stop would mean admitting the cold had won. By the second year after the siege, the city bore its scars openly. Streets still pockmarked with shell damage. Buildings standing half-collapsed beside makeshift stalls selling bread and mended shoes. The hospital's windows had been patched with mismatched panes, so that sunlight fell in uneven patches on the worn tile floors. Life, in its stubborn way, was returning. The nurse, by now a familiar figure to everyone, had slowed her pace. Not from lack of will, but from the toll years of strain had taken on her body. A limp in her left leg made the stairs more difficult. And sometimes, in the quiet between patients, she would sit by the window and rest her hands in her lap, looking out at the street as though measuring its distance from her youth. And yet, when a new epidemic threatened the city, a fever brought in by traders from the coast, she was among the first to act. It began quietly. A handful of cases in the poorer quarter, dismissed by officials as seasonal illness. But she saw the pattern, and she knew what unchecked contagion could do. Without waiting for permission, she began organizing a team of young volunteers, training them to disinfect, to carry water, to keep the sick apart from the healthy. Her defiance drew ire from the city council, who feared the news of an outbreak would scare away desperately needed trade. A tense meeting was held, and I've read accounts of how she stood before the mayor. Thin, tired, but unyielding, and said, "You can silence me, but you can't silence the fever. It will speak for itself." She won, in part because the truth had already started to seep through the city's alleys and courtyards. Families were whispering about the illness. Shopkeepers noticed fewer customers. By the time the council officially acknowledged the outbreak, her team had already contained much of its spread. Still, it came at a cost. She lost 2 volunteers, both young women she had trained, within the first month. At their burial, she spoke softly, her voice carrying in the brittle winter air. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is what you do while fear sits beside you. I pause here, because reading those words always reminds me of something my mother used to say. You can't measure a life in days, only in the weight of the days that matter. The nurse must have carried more than her share of heavy days. The controversy came when the government tried to claim credit for ending the epidemic, releasing statements praising swift official action and omitting her entirely. In the cafes, people scoffed at the reports, and in the hospital corridors, the truth passed in murmurs. She, for her part, didn't seem to care. At least, not outwardly. But I think of that small box she kept by her bed, where she stored letters, ribbons, and other tokens from people she'd helped. Perhaps their quiet gratitude meant more to her than any public recognition could. That spring, when the fever had finally ebbed, she began tending a small garden in the hospital courtyard. Not flowers. Vegetables. Herbs. The sort of things that could nourish. The soil was poor, but she coaxed life from it. Patients would sit nearby, breathing in the scent of mint and rosemary, feeling for a moment as though the city's wounds were healing alongside their own. It's strange to picture her there, kneeling in the dirt, because the image is so at odds with the woman who once faced down a council full of politicians. But perhaps that's the truth of resilience. It adapts, shifting from the battlefield to the garden without losing its force. I find myself wondering if she ever longed to leave the city, to escape the memories stitched into its streets. Maybe she dreamed of the sea, or of a quieter village where no one knew her name. And yet, she stayed. Not because she couldn't go, but because her work was here. woven into the cobblestones and the lives she touched. In the evenings, she still walked home alone through the narrow lanes, carrying her worn leather bag. Lamps glowed in the windows, and the air was filled with a mingled sense of bread baking, coal smoke, and the faint, ever-present undercurrent of history. And perhaps, in those solitary walks, she found the same uneasy peace I sometimes feel, knowing that while the world may forget your name, the traces you leave are written in others in ways that outlast even memory. The years turned, and the city's skyline began to change. New buildings rose where ruins had stood, their pale stone and glass almost jarring against the soot-darkened remnants of the old streets. But the nurse's world seemed to shrink rather than expand. Age had bent her back further, slowed her step. But she still kept the same route to the hospital every morning, her leather bag swinging gently at her side. It was during this time that whispers began of a foreign delegation visiting the city. Wealthy benefactors seeking to invest in its recovery. The newspapers were full of smiling officials and polished speeches. But beneath the gloss, there were mutterings about funds being siphoned away, of projects promised but never begun. She noticed it first in the hospital. Supplies that had been pledged didn't arrive. Promised repairs to the leaking roof were delayed, then abandoned altogether. Patients who should have received care were told to wait, because the city's new health initiative had redirected resources elsewhere. I imagined the frustration building inside her. After all she had seen: wars, epidemics, shortages. It must have felt like a betrayal to watch great undo what hardship had not destroyed. And then, a breaking point. A young mother, recently widowed, came to the hospital with her child burning with fever. They had been turned away twice before for lack of medicine. This time, the nurse refused to let them leave empty-handed. She took medicine from the storehouse without permission, knowing it could cost her job. The confrontation was inevitable. A city inspector appeared the next day, ledger in hand, ready to accuse. But she met him with a gaze so steady it seemed to draw the air from the room. "If you want the medicine back," she told him, "you can go to that child's bedside and take it yourself." He left without another word. That incident made her a quiet hero once again among the people, though the authorities saw her as a nuisance, a relic unwilling to bend to the new order. Still, they didn't dismiss her. Perhaps they feared the backlash, or perhaps some remnant of respect restrained them. By now, she had trained a generation of younger nurses, many of whom spoke of her as both mentor and mother. They remembered the way she would correct their bandaging with gentle hands, the way her voice softened when speaking to frightened patients, the way she always seemed to know when someone was carrying more than they could bear. One of those nurses, years later, would write, "She taught us that medicine without compassion is just chemistry. And compassion, without courage, is nothing at all." It's strange to think that while her influence spread like roots beneath the city, her personal life remained so starkly solitary. No family visited her at the hospital. No one waited for her at home. I suspect, though, that her solitude was not entirely empty. It was filled with the faces and voices of those she had helped. That might be enough for some. Then came the night of the fire. A tenement building in the working quarter caught alight after a faulty gas lamp exploded. The flames leapt from window to window faster than the fire brigade could respond. People poured into the streets, shouting names, carrying what little they could save. And in the chaos, there she was, no longer quick on her feet, but still wading into smoke to lead people out, guiding them with a wet cloth over their faces. They said she stayed until the last body was pulled from the wreckage. her own clothes singed, her hair streaked with soot. When asked why she had risked herself at her age, she simply replied, "Because there was still someone inside." I linger on that moment because it captures her essence. Unconcerned with the scale of the act, only with the immediacy of the need. Not long after, she collapsed in the hospital corridor. Exhaustion, the doctors said, compounded by years of strain. She spent weeks in bed, tended by the very nurses she had once trained. And though she recovered enough to walk again, something in her seemed quieter, as though the fire had taken more from her than she admitted. It's here that I can't help but think about the weight of a life lived in service. We speak of sacrifice as though it's one grand gesture. But for her, it was 1,000 small ones, strung together over decades until they formed a chain she could not put down. And perhaps, in those quiet days after the fire, she began to sense that her time was drawing near. Not in fear, but in readiness. Because what more could she give than she already had? Winter settled over the city like a heavy quilt, muting the sound of footsteps and wrapping the streets in pale frost. The nurse's apartment, a small second-floor space above a bakery, was warmed more by the oven downstairs than by her own thin radiator. She spent her mornings now in a chair by the window, watching life pass beneath her. The clatter of carts, the occasional burst of children's laughter. It was enough to keep her tethered to the world. I imagine her hands resting in her lap, the skin thin and veined, her once firm grip now soft with age. Yet, in those hands lived decades of muscle memory. How to roll a bandage just so. How to hold a pulse without letting go. How to lift the child without waking them. The city still remembered her. Neighbors would bring baskets of bread. Letters would arrive from former patients, sometimes with photographs of grown children she'd once nursed through sickness. One letter came from a man now in uniform, serving far from home, thanking her for saving his leg when he was a boy. She kept that letter by her bedside. But there was something else she kept there, wrapped in linen. A brass pin shaped like a small lantern. It had been given to her decades earlier, after the epidemic, as a token of gratitude from the mayor. She never wore it. Said it was too fine for a working uniform. But in the evenings, she would hold it in her palm like a memory made solid. Her health began to falter more noticeably. The climb to her apartment became a slow, deliberate task. Some days, she did not leave at all. Yet she refused offers to move in with others. Independence was part of her marrow. "If I can make tea and open my window," she told a young nurse who visited, "I'm fine." And so the city adjusted around her. Shopkeepers checked in when they could. A neighbor shoveled her steps after snowfalls. At the hospital, they saved her a seat in the staff room, just in case she felt well enough to visit. It was on one of those rare visits that she was coaxed into giving a talk to the new trainees. Standing before them, leaning on her cane, she spoke plainly. "You will save lives. But that's not enough. You must see the person, not the illness. And when the rules get in the way of care..." Here she paused, her eyes crinkling with a smile. "Remember that you answer first to the one in pain, not the one in charge." It was the last time many saw her in public. When she passed, it was in her sleep, the winter light just beginning to filter through her window. The brass lantern pin lay beside her hand. The news spread quickly. Not through the official channels, but in quiet conversations, in the murmur of shopkeepers, in the tears of old friends and strangers alike. Her funeral was simple, but the crowd was not. People from every part of the city came. Dock workers, teachers, merchants, mothers holding children. Former patients walked alongside nurses in crisp uniforms. And as they laid her to rest, someone placed that brass lantern atop her coffin. The mayor gave a short speech, calling her a light in our city's darkest hours, but I think she would have rolled her eyes at that. Too grand. Too neat. Her own measure of herself was likely simpler. I did what I could, when it needed doing. Long after, on quiet winter evenings, her name would still come up in conversation. Someone would tell a story. How she stayed all night by a bedside. How she found food for a hungry family. How she ignored an order that made no sense. Each memory kept her alive a little longer, stitched into the fabric of the city she had given her life to. And as I sit here now, at my own kitchen table, the lamplight pooling across my notes, I think of her often. Not because she was extraordinary in the way history books usually demand, but because she was steadfast. And in a world that changes so quickly, steadfastness is its own quiet form of courage. Sometimes, when the wind is sharp and the streets are empty, I imagine her walking ahead of me. Small, determined, her coat buttoned tight, that leather bag in hand. Still going somewhere she is needed. The air in this room feels softer now, as though the telling of her story has eased something in me. History, after all, is not only kings and treaties. It is also the hands that held us steady when the world tilted. So perhaps, tonight, as you drift toward sleep, you might carry her with you. The nurse who saved a city not once, but every day she chose to serve. Let her be a reminder that even the smallest acts, done with constancy, can shape the fate of many. Rest well, dear listeners. And may your dreams be lit by the lantern she left behind. End of script. Sweet dreams filled with the stories of the past.